I'm a morning person. The psychologists say there's two kinds of people in the world. People who love to get up early in the morning and people who hate people who love to get up early in the morning. And so either way, I hope to keep your attention. I have a friend, just a quick story to start, who was speaking at a conference, a family event like this some years ago. And after his message, a little boy ran up to him and out of nowhere just said, "Your jokes aren't funny." And it kind of caught my friend off guard, but he kind of dismissed it, kept talking with people, and the boy went off. And then a few minutes later, the boy ran back up and said, "And your sermons are too long." And, he's a pastor, so he's gracious, kind of smiled. The boy ran off, and he thought he was done. And then a few minutes later, the boy came back up again and said, "And they're boring." And this time, he kind of looked at him. He's going to say something, but then he saw the boy's mother kind of approaching from the other side of the room, kind of running over, saying, "Oh my gosh, Pastor, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I have no idea what my son just said to you." But he's in this phase where he just repeats everything he hears us say. And so I will do my best to be as brief and amusing as possible for the next few moments. So before we dive in, I just want to get to know the lay of the land here. Just a quick question, not going to ask anything of you, but how many of you, if you're willing to raise your hand, are here for the very first time at Mount Hermon? Any hands up? Just a couple people? Yep. Awesome. Thank you. Yep. How about this one? Hold your hand up if you've been here more than 5 times. Okay. Keep it up if it's more than 10. Keep it up if it's more than 20. More than 30. Keep it up. Keep it up if it's more than 40 years. Oh my goodness. Keep it up if it's more than 50. Wow. Can we celebrate these folks? More than 50 years. I just got to say, they ought to give you a discount. Can we give them a discount next year? So I'm going to get in trouble for that. Anyway, as I shared this morning, I'm a pastor in the Seattle area. But before we lived in Seattle, I spent about 20 years serving in the Bay Area. And so I spent a number of years, been at these grounds numerous times. And our family's been here at family camp pretty much every year these last few years. And we don't just come when I speak, we come even as guests. So if I'm not here, I'm out there. And I just want to name, you are sitting in a sacred place where God, over literally the past century, has done amazing work, changed countless lives, strengthened marriages and relationships. He's raised up new generations of leaders here. And I believe he wants to do a new and transformative work in you today if your heart is open to it. And so all I'm going to ask over these next few moments is that you would have an open-hearted posture of your spirit. Which brings me to the theme we're going to explore for the next 4 nights together that I'm calling the gospel in the battle. The gospel in the battle. Last time I was here, I talked about Sabbath. People thought it was a little too sleepy. They fell asleep. Kind of worked, I guess, but we're not going to do that one. So we're going to spice things up a little bit. The gospel in the battle. And I'm not talking about like going out and thinking about culture wars or us versus them or political conflict. The gospel in the battle, what that means is, what's the good news in the challenge you're facing? Like, what's the good news in the challenge you're facing? What's the good news about that difficult situation or the difficult person or that seemingly impossible problem? Like, where's the good news in that? Where's the gospel in the battle? Famous psalm, you all know it. Psalm 23, David writes these words: "You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies." To be present with an enemy means you're pretty close to a battle. So where's that table? Ever wondered? Where's the good news? Where's the gospel when the battle is raging? Because here's the thing. I've been a pastor for 20 years. I can tell you this with great confidence. Everybody is fighting a battle. Everybody you meet, doesn't matter what age or stage, where they're from, what their background is, everybody's fighting a battle. Every one of you right now, in some way or another, in some part of your life, you are fighting a battle. Maybe your marriage is in a hard place. Maybe you're battling a habit or an addiction or a secret habit. Maybe you're grieving loss or disappointment. Maybe your career plans aren't going the way you wanted or the way you expected. Maybe the battle is in your family. Maybe the battle's with one of your kids or a situation with one of your kids. Our kids are 7 and 4 years old. Putting on socks is a battle, okay? Like, everything's a battle. And then we're not battling with them. They're battling with each other. I mean, to get to family camp, we had to put our kids on an airplane. Any parents ever had to put your kids on an airplane? It's craziness, right? A few years ago, we were on a trip and our kids were really little and we're on a flight across the country and there's 4 of us crammed into 3 seats because we're trying to save money with that little extra lap thing, right? The discount for the lap kid. That is crazy. Don't ever do that. We had 4 of us in 3 seats and there's screaming and there's snot everywhere and there's diapers everywhere. And you're in trouble when the flight attendant asks if your kids want to play outside. You've got something going on. Maybe there's a battle in your family. Maybe the battle is more on the inside. Maybe you're battling anxiety or depression or worry. Maybe the battle is loneliness or shame or a sense of unworthiness inside. Maybe you feel discouraged or lacking joy. Or maybe some of you just been living through kind of a down season. Anyone else ever just kind of had a season? You couldn't put your finger on it, but just kind of a down season. I recently read an article about how a person's well-being shifts throughout the course of their life. Really interesting stuff. And according to the research, there's this thing called the happiness U. I'd never heard about this before, the happiness U. And the basic idea is that a person's happiness in life is kind of shaped like a U over a lifetime. Like it's kind of like this, meaning your happiness kind of declines down through your 20s, through your 40s, when stress levels are at their highest, career, family, finances, and then slowly pick back up between your 50s and 70s. By the way, any guesses on what the unhappiest age in life was according to the research? 48 years and 9 months. Any guesses on how old I am? 48 years and 9 months this month. So if I come across a little grumpy tonight, it's because this is the unhappiest day of my life right now. Like I'm in the unhappiest moment. Aren't you glad you picked week 5, everybody? Come on, let's do this. Everybody is fighting a battle. But what I want to help you see over the course of these next few nights is that there's always gospel in the battle. And not just afterwards, not just reflecting back, but in the battle. There's actually good news in the hard thing, in the hard stuff. So we're going to look together at a number of different battles we face and kinds of battles we face. Just for those of you who are planners, you're a J on the Myers-Briggs, you're going to love this part of the message. I'm going to give you the week in advance. Tomorrow, we're going to look at the battles we face circumstantially, the external battles of our lives, the difficult situations and circumstances and people that we face. Anyone else had a difficult person in their life? Just raise your hand. Any difficult people? Yep. Don't look at them. Just raise your hand, right? Yep. Just make sure you bring them tomorrow. Then on Wednesday, we're going to look at the spiritual battles. What's going on spiritually when we're in these battles and conflicts and difficulties? Because the Apostle Paul says, and many of you know this verse, our battle is not against flesh and blood. So what's actually going on spiritually when we're struggling? And on Thursday, we're going to look at the battle that Jesus fought for us on the cross and how to live in light of that battle. But tonight, we're going to start by looking inward. I'm going to challenge you tonight to dare to peer inward. Some of you, when you hear a great message, you're already thinking about, I know who this talk would be good for. You're thinking about that other person, right? Tonight is about you, and tonight is about me. And it may be, again, it's inward. Maybe it's a battle with discouragement or anxiety or loneliness or shame. Because I think a lot of times we spend maybe too much time trying to manage and figure out what's happening to us, right? And not enough time trying to understand and deal with what's happening in us. So we're going to look inward. And to guide the conversation, we're going to explore a story in the Old Testament about a prophet in ancient Israel named Elijah. Now, some of you know this name. You know Elijah as that bold, fearless, outspoken, fiery prophet who stood up to a king named Ahab back in his day. And by the way, Ahab's not a good king, not a good guy. And how Elijah challenged Ahab and these 450 prophets of Baal to set up an altar to their God while Elijah set up an altar to his God. Anyone remember this story? And whoever's God could light the altar on fire was the winner. It was sort of like a contest, like a one-upsmanship. Whose God's going to win? And the Baal prophets called on their gods over and over, and nothing happened. And if you know the story, it's kind of funny. Elijah starts taunting them. Taunting is in the Bible. It's weird. I don't know. He starts taunting them. Maybe your gods are asleep or busy or they're watching Bridgerton or whatever their gods are doing. They're not paying attention here. And then Elijah calls on the Lord, and so much fire comes down from heaven, it burns the sacrifice, the wood, the stones, the soil, the water. Everything goes up. And Elijah has all those false prophets executed. So here's why I tell you that context. You would think Elijah would be feeling pretty good inside. I mean, in terms of prophetic ministry, this is like as successful of a day you can have as the day Elijah just had. You think he's feeling great. Given the success and the appearance on the outside, you think he'd feel great on the inside. And isn't that how we judge each other, right? We're always comparing our insides to other people's outsides, aren't we? It's why we feel often so bad, because we're like, oh my goodness, they look great. I feel like a mess. Let's look at what the insides of Elijah are like. It's our story. It's going to be from 1 Kings 19. I'm going to read about 18 verses, so bear with me. This is a fantastic story, so hang in there with me. Here we go. Verse 1. The text says, now Ahab told Jezebel everything Elijah had done and how he killed all the prophets with the sword. So Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah to say, may the gods deal with me, be it ever so severely, if by this time tomorrow I do not make your life like one of them. Elijah was afraid and ran for his life. The prophet that just won the battle of the gods is on the run. When he came to Beersheba in Judah, he left his servant there while he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness. He came to a broom bush, sat down under it, and prayed that he might die. I have had enough, Lord, he said. Take my life. I'm no better than my ancestors. Then he lay down under the bush and he fell asleep. All at once, an angel touched him and said, get up and eat. He looked around, and there by his head was some bread baked over hot coals and a jar of water. He ate and drank, then he lay down again. The angel of the Lord came back a second time, touched him and said, get up and eat, for the journey is too much for you. So he got up, ate, and drank. Strengthened by that food, he traveled 40 days and 40 nights until he reached Horeb, the mountain of God, same as Mount Sinai in the Old Testament. Then he went into a cave and he spent the night. And there the word of the Lord came to him, saying, get this, what are you doing here, Elijah? He replied, I've been very zealous for the Lord God Almighty. The Israelites have rejected your covenant, torn down your altars, and put your prophets to death with a sword. I am the only one left, and now they are trying to kill me too. The Lord said, go out and stand on the mountain in the presence of the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by. This should be really cool, right? Then a great and powerful wind tore the mountains apart and shattered the rocks before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. After the wind, there was an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. After the earthquake came a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. God's always in the fire. He was just in the fire. Where is God? And after the fire came a gentle whisper. When Elijah heard it, he pulled his cloak over his face, went out, stood at the mouth of the cave. Then a voice said to him, what are you doing here, Elijah? And he replied, I have been very zealous for the Lord God Almighty. The Israelites have rejected your covenant, torn down your altars, and put your prophets to death with the sword. I am the only one left, and now they're trying to kill me too. Any deja vu moments happening here? I mean, he's saying the same thing. And the Lord said, go back the way you came and go to the desert of Damascus. When you get there, anoint Hazael, king over Aram. Anoint also Jehu, son of Nimshi, king over Israel. And anoint Elisha, son of Shaphat, from Abel, Meholah, to succeed you as prophet. Jehu will put to death any who escape the sword of Hazael, and Elisha will put to death any who escape the sword of Jehu. Yet I reserve 7,000 in Israel, all whose knees have not bowed down to Baal, and whose mouths have not kissed him. Okay, you still with me? Still here? I know that was a lot. It's important we've heard the whole story so we can understand how God responds to this bit of Elijah's life. So what in the world is going on here in this story? Well, if you caught nothing else, Elijah has a little bit of a battle happening on the inside. A little bit of a battle. For example, he's clearly feeling deeply discouraged, perhaps depressed. I've had enough, he says. He's anxious. He's worried. The Israelites have put all the prophets to death, and now they're trying to kill me too. He's afraid. He's alone, and he's expressing feelings of loneliness. I am the only one left. Remember that phrase? And there's also deep signs of shame and unworthiness. Take my life. I'm no better than my ancestors. So here's the prophet of God, the most successful prophet in his day, most famous guy in town, having a little bit of a mental and emotional breakdown. And I'm just so glad. And here's why I'm glad. I'm not glad for Elijah's sake. I feel bad for Elijah. Like, can you imagine having your very worst day put in the Bible for everybody to read about for thousands of years, right? I'm so glad because here's the thing. This is what my life is like. And this is what my feelings are like. And this is what's often happening on the inside when you can look at me and say, well, he must be doing great. On the inside, I'm having some of these same thoughts. Increasingly, more and more people today are having struggles, mental health, emotional health, spiritual health, psychological health. I want to go through a little data for you because it's alarming, kind of the mental, emotional state of our society, if you will. For example, the percentage of Americans who currently have or are being treated for depression has gone from 11% to 18% in less than a decade. Anxiety disorders now affect over 40 million adults. That's almost 20% of the population, and that percentage is twice that number in adolescents, 40%. In May of 2023, the Surgeon General of the United States declared a national health crisis, not around smoking or drinking or unhealthy diets. Anyone remember last May of 23 what the announcement was about? National epidemic of loneliness. And do you know who's suffering the most? Young people ages 16 to 24. In fact, Gen Z is being called the lonely generation. More digitally connected than ever, the loneliest. They are the loneliest generation that's ever been recorded, ever. And here's the thing. I've wrestled with some of these things, same things. I wasn't aware of this when I was younger, but I grew up with a lot of generalized anxiety. So that's just feeling anxious sort of about any certain thing that's happening at home. I worried about what my parents thought of me. In school, I worried about my grades. When I got to high school, I worried about going out on dates. I didn't go on any dates actually, but I would worry about how they'd go if I actually went on those dates. And when I was in college, I worried about what I would study. When I was out of college, I worried about the career I would pursue. When I was single, I worried about who I was going to marry. And you'd think when I became a pastor, all my worries would have gone away, right? Nope. So in my early 30s, I decided I would finally see a counselor. And I can still remember that day sitting in that chair in that office in Palo Alto, California, when she looked me in the eye and said, Scotty, you have anxiety. And my first response was, no, I don't. I'm a pastor. My job's to help people who feel anxious, not to have anxiety. But inside, I knew she was right. And you know how I knew? Because I was already worrying about it. Worry is like one of my spiritual gifts. Like I do it recreationally. And not only did that journey into anxiety kind of begin that day, it also led me to confront issues of deep shame and unworthiness in my life. I didn't just feel anxious. I felt ashamed that I was anxious. Which, by the way, is another prevalent battle inside that people are facing today. Did you know that 85% of Americans struggle with some form of low self-esteem or self-worth? 85%. So all that's just prelude to say, I'm just so glad this story about Elijah's little breakdown is in the Bible because it shows us that even the great prophet of God struggled with fear and discouragement and loneliness, not just because he was a prophet, but because he was a person. James 5:17 says this, Elijah was a human being even as we are. He's a person. And here's the thing about human beings. We are not always as neat and tidy on the inside as we look on the outside, right? And mental health struggles, emotional challenges, they can emerge from our circumstances. They can also emerge from just how your brain's wired, from your family of origin. Which means we're not just automatically in control of whether or not we feel anxious or depressed or worried, nor can we just snap our fingers and make all that stuff go away. The problem is, and some of you have experienced this, especially in church environments, and I'm going to get on my soapbox for a moment because churches have been especially kind of off in this area. We sort of act like when people are going through sort of a mental or emotional challenge or struggle, they could just snap their fingers and get over it. I remember years ago thinking if I just had more faith, I wouldn't feel anxious. If I just believed strong enough, I wouldn't feel down or discouraged. And I would tell myself implicitly, just Scotty, you need to get over it. You need to believe in God. You need to be optimistic and positive. The irony of all that is we don't talk that way about physical illness, do we? Right? Like no one would say, hey, I get that you have food poisoning, but can you just get over it? right? Or have you tried just not having the flu? I mean, right? We don't say that. When someone gets physically sick, what do? Well, we're not a very caring community here. We don't even know. We have no idea what to do, right? We send flowers, we set up a meal train. We go and visit them. But if someone gets depressed or has a panic attack or a breakdown, what do? We wonder what's wrong with them. We try to give them advice. Or we don't say anything because we don't know what to say. Which, by the way, is one of the reasons why today, and this is a big problem in church communities. It's one of the reasons why people avoid talking about what's going on the inside. When they show up at your small group or at your church or in the Christian community they're part of. I just read an article that said 70% of people would tell their family member if they were physically sick, but only 15% would tell a family member if they're battling depression. Only 15%. So here's the thing. If Elijah, the famous prophet, struggled with his mental and emotional health, there's no shame in any one of us going through something similar. Happens to prophets, happens to pastors, happens to parents, happens to plumbers, happens to everybody. Not because you're broken, because you're human. Are you with me so far? Yeah? Which brings us back to our story and the first bit of the gospel in this battle, and it's a simple truth. Just want to lay it on you really quick, and it's this. God cares. God cares about your battle, even the ones on the inside. I used to believe somewhat fundamentally that God's posture when I was struggling was a posture of frustration or annoyance or disappointment. Like, Scotty, I've blessed you and I've poured into you and I've invested in you, and why are you struggling? That's what I think. But God's posture is one of great care. I want to walk through how he cares for Elijah. And I wanted you to notice as we go through this, how he cares for Elijah, not just in spiritual ways. We think of God's care as going to be spiritual kind of only. But look at what he does for Elijah. First, when the angel comes to Elijah, he doesn't just talk to him, he touches him. And remember that detail? He touches him twice. Why? Because when you're struggling inside, emotionally, psychologically, mentally, positive physical touch matters. God knows this. God knows it releases those yummy chemicals in your brain that reduce stress and boost your immune system and ease physical pain. It matters. I heard a story about a pastor who was teaching on this kind of principle in his church, and he cited a study that found that if people get 10 meaningful touches a day, they actually live longer. 10 meaningful touches, they live longer. And while he was speaking, he saw in front of him, in a row in front of him, a husband turn to his wife and go, 1, 2, 3, 4. So that's not what we're talking about, okay? I'm talking about the power of a long hug. I'm talking about the power of someone holding your hand when you're afraid. I'm talking about the power of getting a good massage, right? We did a retreat with our church staff not too long ago. We hired massage therapists who gave back messages to our massage during my talks. I'm pretty sure no one heard a word that I said, but they all felt cared for and restored. God cared about Elijah, positive physical touch. He also showed care by providing Elijah with nourishment. Anyone else, when you're feeling stressed, have bad eating habits? Just hold up your hand if you're willing to confess publicly. Yep. So we got about half of you confess. The other half are lying. Right? The angel doesn't wake up Elijah and give him a lecture. What does he do? He wakes him and gives him bread to eat and fresh water to drink. Because when the battle is raging inside, the quality of what you eat matters. God cares for him by giving him something else, the space to rest. I love that the main thing Elijah does in the first half of the story is sleep. It's as if God is saying, we're not going to even talk about your problems until you get a little rest. How about that? And if there's anything we need in our day today, it's rest. Sometimes God's will for your life is just to go to sleep. I can see some of you taking this seriously right now. You're nodding off. That's okay. Yeah. God gives him the space to rest and also the opportunity to be active physically. Elijah gets up and he walks 250 miles from Beersheba to Mount Horeb. I have a picture, I think a map. Do you have this one? Of the map of him walking, what that would look like? Yes? No? No? They're saying no, so you don't get them out. Okay, anyway, he wasn't just sitting there, he was moving. And when the battle is raging on the inside, one of the best things you can do is just move. Over the past few years, I've become kind of an active runner, and the secret that's helped me fall in love with running is that the goal of running is not running. And if you set out to run with the goal to run, you will quit running really, really soon. Running is just the means. It's how I get to the goal. What's the goal? Getting out of my head or getting in better shape. Or here's one, getting a break from my children for about an hour, right? It's a great one. Elijah was moving, he was active, and most importantly, this journey took time. 250 miles. It should have taken him 10 to 12 days. Elijah did that journey in 40 days, meaning he took his time. He wasn't in a hurry, because when it comes to the battle inside with depression or grief or loneliness, healing is going to take time. Some of you have been working on challenges on the inside, and you've been in that place for months or years, and you know this is true. It takes time. Some battles take the better part of a lifetime. And sometimes God's healing isn't about being freed from that burden. It's about being given the power just to keep carrying it. But when we're struggling on the inside, here's kind of the summary. When we're struggling on the inside, and here I'm saying this as a pastor who leads church services every week, when you're struggling on the inside, you need more than just songs and sermons. You need touch and food and rest and activity and time. You are an embodied soul. And when the battle is raging inside, God cares for your whole body and life. It's one of the great things about being here this week, by the way. You can actually experience maybe taking some time to care for your whole person. Your sleep, your eat, your moving, and all of that. And by doing so, you can experience God's care for your life. This week is also a chance to confront all the ways you've isolated yourself over the past year. If you remember the story, when Elijah ran for his life, what did it say? He left his servant where? Behind. And he went out in the wilderness alone. Now, I will say, getting away with Jesus in isolation or solitude is a great practice. It's a key practice in our life with Jesus. But we shouldn't miss the fact that Elijah had his breakdown when he isolated himself. So what did God tell him to do? Go back to the what? The people. He lists names, the people in your life. Hazael, Jehu, Elisha. Wherever the battle is you're facing, whatever it is, you cannot face it alone. God reminded me of this in a very tangible way this past summer during a sabbatical. I was in a place in just south of Portland, Oregon called Mount Angel Abbey. Maybe some of you have been up to Mount Angel Abbey, just southeast of Portland. It's this beautiful monastery with a beautiful guest house and sanctuary. There's even a brewery on campus with a big sign out front that says, "Taste and Believe." And so I did, and it was great. But I went down to hear from God, and each day I read from Scripture. I spent time in silence. I went to all the 6 prayer services a day that they had. And nothing happened on the first day, and nothing happened on the second day. And on the third day, I was feeling a little frustrated. So I said, God, where are you going to speak? What are you going to say? I'm here to hear from you. And right at that moment, I looked over at my phone, which was turned off on my desk. I wasn't using my phone all week. And I had this very clear impression of God saying, I want you to pick up your phone and text some friends. And I remember thinking, God, that's not why I'm here. My phone is off. I'm here to hear from you. But this impression wouldn't go away. So I picked up my phone, turned it on. I texted about a half a dozen people in my life. They were longtime friends with whom I had lost touch. And in the weeks and months that followed, God has used every one of those friendships to encourage and challenge me in the battles that I've been working through in my life. Not only that, by the way, reconnecting with old friends is a ton of fun. And it's another reminder of a reminder that God cares for us in the battle. Whatever battle you're facing, you can't face it in isolation anymore. And anytime in any one of my messages this week, if you want to get out your phone and text a friend, you do it, okay? Permission granted, you do it. In the midst of Elijah's breakdown, he discovers, one, that God cares for his whole life, his whole person. That's the first one. Here's a second take home from it. He also discovers in the breakdown, in the battle, that God is close. He's close. I don't know about you, but when I'm feeling discouraged or down or anxious, my temptation, my My sense is that God is somehow far away, which is why I love how God speaks to Elijah. We know this part of the story well. Maybe you know the story. When God doesn't come in the wind or the earthquake or the fire, how does God come? In a gentle whisper. Here's the thing about whispering. You can only hear a whisper when you're really, really close. Really close. And in fact, God doesn't just stay close to Elijah. He followed him out there. You want to get that part of the story? Elijah goes 250 miles away. God follows him all the way out there. It's almost like he's saying, I don't care how far you run away, how lonely you feel, where you're going to go, how low it gets, wherever you're going, God's like, I'm going there too. I have a good friend named Steve. And several years ago, Steve lost his son in a tragic accident. And it was and still is the greatest loss of his life, something that he says he will never fully get over. And so needless to say, it's been a great battle, a huge, tremendous battle for him inside. And he was sharing with me that even years later, he still feels like this grief follows him around, like it's following him around. He says he likes to imagine that it's this little dog. And it follows him around. And sometimes it's quiet and it's just resting there. But sometimes it's loud and it's barking and it's raging and it's angry. But he says, whether quiet or loud, that little dog named Grief's always following me around. And so I asked him just honestly, I'm like, well, how do you get through it? Like, how do you get through a day if this grief is always following you around? And he said, I remember Psalm 23. Remember preparing a table in the presence of my enemies. But two verses later, Psalm 23, verse 6, David says, surely your goodness and love will what? Follow me all the days of my life. And Steve said, that's when I realized I actually have 3 dogs. I've got a little pack of dogs. They follow me around. Yes, grief is one of them, and it's never going away. But there's another dog there called God's goodness. And another dog there called God's love. And they follow me too. And I figured, if you're a dog person, you love a story like that, right? And if you're a cat person, we have people who can pray for you after the service. We just, Did you know that God's goodness and love followed you here this week? Did you know that it followed you here? Like that you can't outrun it, you can't escape it, you can't get away from it? You can't tell it to stop following you. It's like a little dog is going to follow you everywhere. Whether you're here for a rest or you feel like Elijah, mental, emotional breakdown in a cave, God's goodness and his love, it's followed you here. And maybe part of what you need to do this week is just be open to the whole pack of dogs that are with you today. Let yourself be aware. You got more than one dog. God cares. God is close. And then one more quick takeaway, and we're going to close up with this one. God is not done. When the battle's raging, when you're feeling it inside, when you feel weak, when you feel unworthy, God is not done with you or with his calling on your life. I don't know if it's just like stigma in churches or if it's just the tendency of the human soul to have self-doubt, but it's just so easy when we're struggling on the inside to feel like I'm a failure or I'm not worth it or I'm no longer useful to God because I got this mess that maybe nobody else knows about. But notice, God doesn't come to Elijah and say, well, you've really made a mess of things. Yesterday, you were my strong prophet. What in the heck's going on here? He doesn't say, better hang up your cleats and let someone else finish the job. He says, what are you doing here, Elijah? Twice, what are you doing here, Elijah? In other words, you still have a job to do. I still have a purpose for your life. I still have really good plans for you, Elijah. I've been wrestling with a number of, I talked about anxiety. I got a number of little dogs that follow me around, troubles and struggles on the inside that I may never shake for the rest of my life. And I've shared openly about those things with my church. I'm sharing about some of them now. It can feel a little bit vulnerable, but here's what I can tell you. Those weaknesses and challenges and battles, they've never actually been a liability to what God wanted to do in my life. Never once. Does it make it pleasant? Does it mean I don't wish some of those dogs would go away? But they're not a liability. Why? Because those things, those battles, those challenges, friends, that's your ministry. That's your testimony. That's how the strength of God is going to shine through you to somebody else. And I'm pretty sure Elijah felt something similar. You know, I think one of the most amazing moments in the whole story is when the text says, and so he got up. Remember that moment? He's lying there, he's down. The text says, so he got up. Remember, this is a guy who just a day earlier was like, I'm finished, take my life. And when you're in a place like that, and maybe some of you have been in a place like that, it's so easy to think, I'm just going to check out, give up, shut down, stay in bed. But Elijah doesn't give up. He gets up. And sometimes that's all God needs to redeem your day is just getting up. Tomorrow morning, if you're having a bad season or a bad week, if something's going on, just get up and see what God does in your day. Because sometimes the greatest act of faith, just getting up and taking on another day with whatever battle you're facing inside. And here's the even better news, and with this, we're going to wrap things up. God isn't done with you, even if you can't get up. Even if you're at your lowest low, and maybe you're not there today, but you know someone who is, or maybe you've been there before. If you haven't been there before, you will be someday. In that lowest of low, that breakdown moment when you feel like, I'm not sure what I should do next. But the most profound moment in this whole story is when the angel comes to Elijah and says, get up and eat. And here's the line I want you to remember. If you had a Bible, circle this line. Get up and eat, for the journey is too much for you. Can we be real for a moment? That sometimes the journey's just too much. Sometimes the discouragement's too much. Sometimes the anxiety's too much. Sometimes the battle is too much. Sometimes you're just in over your head. And this verse reminds us that God knows, like he knows. And not only that, get this, God understands because he's been there too. When Jesus on the cross cried out, on the cross, he didn't cry out, okay, God, I've got this whole crucifixion thing. He cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me? And when he said those words, the people watching said, he's calling for who? Elijah. Because Elijah was there. Elijah had been there too. The journey's too much. And then he died, and they put him in a cave, and everyone thought the story was over, the battle was lost. But then on the third day, what'd he do? He got up. God raised him from the dead, because while the journey can be too much for us, guess what, friends? It is never too much for him. Some of you know that old saying, God will never give you more than you can handle. I don't know where that came from, but it's sure not the Bible. In fact, the Apostle Paul said just the opposite. This verse, he told the church in Corinth, while we were under great pressure, far beyond our ability to endure, so that we despaired of life itself. That's when the journey's too much. He said, but this happened so that we might not rely on ourselves, but on God who raises the dead. Which means sometimes the battle is more than you can handle, but it will never be more than God can handle. Because no matter what's going on in your life, God cares, and he's close, and he is not done, friends, with you. And tomorrow we're going to look at the problems and people and circumstances in our lives that are just too big, too giant for us to manage. But for now, let's pray. Jesus, I'm so thankful this story is in your word. I'm so thankful that Elijah had a human moment that we can all relate to. When his thoughts, his discouragement, his fears got the best of him. When he got overwhelmed on the inside. When the battle just felt like too much. And here's the thing, Jesus, we've all been there. Maybe some of us are there. Someday we're all going to be there. And help us see in this moment, Jesus, that no matter what we're facing or how the battle may be raging, it's not too much for you. That you still have good plans for us and for our lives. That you are close, that you care. God, you just plain care for us. even when we're at our lowest, God. So Jesus, I pray that you would meet us this week in the battles we're facing, the battles we're fighting. Go before us, work in us. Help us find in some little way a little bit of your gospel, a little bit of good news in the battle we're fighting today. And be with us as we go out and have a great night together. We pray this in your name. And everybody said, amen.